When a murder occurs aboard a luxury airplane at 40,000 feet, with no discernible weapon and no means of escape, only one investigator has the small grey cells to solve such an impossible crime. Welcome to Sherlock Mysteries. I'm your host, Edward. Your ongoing support makes these mysteries possible, and I'm glad for each of you visiting me today. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Settle in with your tea or coffee. Choose a comfy seat and ready to join Captain Hastings and the extraordinary Hercule Poirot as they unravel a murder committed in the most limited of conditions. Hercule Poirot and the murder at 40,000 feet before starting. I would request to kindly subscribe to my YouTube channel. Chapter 1. Taking Flight. I've accompanied my friend Hercule Poirot on many remarkable journeys over the years, but none quite as extraordinary as our transatlantic crossing aboard the new Stratolina aircraft in the spring of 1939. The magnificent flying machine with its pressurized cabin allowing flight above the weather represented the very pinnacle of modern aviation. Poirot's gloved fingers drummed a perfect pattern on his armrest as we taxied down the runway. His mustache twitched slightly, a sure sign of his uneasiness. "Calm yourself, old chap," I replied. "These machines are perfectly safe." "It is not a question of safety, mon ami." Poirot straightened his bow tie with great precision. "It is a question of dignity. Man was not meant to be catapulted through the air in such an undignified manner." The engines roared louder. Poirot closed his eyes and gripped the armrests as the aircraft gathered speed, his knuckles whitening beneath his immaculate gloves. Only when we had leveled off at our cruising altitude did he exhale slowly and open his eyes. "You see," I gestured toward the window, smooth as silk beyond the oval glass. Cotton-white clouds stretched beneath us like a vast carpet, occasionally parting to reveal glimpses of the Atlantic's dark blue expanse. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a golden glow across the cabin's polished wood and brushed aluminum interior. Poirot dabbed his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief, though I would have preferred Sir William's business to have been conducted via telegram. Sir William Radford, chairman of Imperial Airways, had personally requested Poirot's presence in New York regarding what his letter described as a matter of international delicacy. The nature of this delicacy remained unknown, but the accompanying first-class tickets had been enticing. A steward in a clean uniform approached our seats, bringing a shiny drink cart ahead of him. "Refreshments, gentlemen. Sirop de cassis, if you please." Poirot ordered only soda water for me. I noted that while the attendant prepared our drinks, I took the opportunity to study our fellow passengers. The first-class cabin had only 8 other guests, each separated by adequate space to ensure solitude, a luxury mirrored in the expensive price of the tickets across the aisle. A broad-shouldered man with silver-streaked hair reviewed paperwork scattered across his fold-down table. A gold signet ring gleamed on his finger as he scribbled notations with a fountain pen behind him. A younger man with wire-rimmed spectacles peered anxiously over his shoulder until the older man, without looking up, said something that caused his companion to retreat. "Victor Carrington," Poirot murmured, following my gaze. "The American industrialist whose factories produced much of the steel for this very aircraft, or so I understand. You know him, but his reputation precedes him." Poirot accepted his drink with a nod of appreciation. "A guy who has made many riches and possibly as many enemies." 2 rows ahead, a gorgeous young woman with copper-colored hair styled in the latest manner adjusted a tiny mirror. Her slender fingers, adorned with an emerald that caught the light with blinding brilliance, tilted the mirror such that it offered a view not of her own reflection, but of Carrington behind her. When she realized my observation, she snapped the compact shut and turned to the older woman beside her, who wore a hat adorned with feathers that quivered with the aircraft's every subtle movement. "Lady West Thalome and her daughter." I ventured. Poirot shook his head. "Lady West, sure the young woman is Mrs. Carrington Victor's wife. You notice the age difference?" A distinguished gentleman in tweeds occupied the seat ahead of us, his grey hair framing a face weathered by exposure to the elements. A leather satchel stuffed with papers protruded from beneath his seat, and he consulted his pocket watch with a frown before flagging down a passing steward with questions about their arrival time. Professor Ambrose Finch Poirot supplied without my asking a most distinguished archaeologist returning from an expedition in Egypt. His discoveries at the tomb of Amenhotep caused quite the sensation. In academic circles, farther up the cabin, a woman whose face seemed vaguely familiar adjusted a silk scarf around her elegant neck. Her movements possessed a theatrical quality, each gesture practiced and precise. That I began, Miss Diana Leverson Poirot, confirmed the actress here. The last passenger in our VIP compartment was a slim, scholarly-looking man with a doctor's bag strapped beside him. He leafed through a medical journal, periodically scribbling remarks in the margins with swift, definite strokes. Dr. Gregory Winters. Poirot said, completing my education of our traveling companions, a surgeon of some renown, traveling to address a conference in New York on the latest advances in surgical techniques. I raised an eyebrow. You seem remarkably well informed about our fellow passengers. Poirot tapped the side of his egg-shaped head, the little grey cells. Hastings, they work even when we are suspended miles above the earth. I requested the passenger manifest before boarding. It is always wise to know with whom one travels. Nestor, the aircraft, hit a pocket of turbulence, causing the drinks on our trays to slosh dangerously. Mrs. Carrington's hand flew to her throat, her knuckles whitening around a pendant that hung there. Professor Finch's papers were spilled across the floor, eliciting a muttered groan as he stooped to pick them. The turbulence passed as quickly as it had come. Victor Carrington glanced at his watch, then rose from his seat and made his way toward the rear of the cabin where the lavatories were located as he passed our row. His sleeve brushed against Poirot's shoulder. He did not apologize or acknowledge the contact. Poirot's eyes narrowed, following Carrington's retreating figure. He leaned slightly toward me, his voice barely above a whisper. Observe Hastings in this metal tube, suspended. Chapter 2. Suspicious conditions. Our first 2 hours in the air passed without incident. The Stratoliner's engines maintained their steady drone as we cruised above a magnificent carpet of clouds. I'd been engrossed in a mystery novel, rather a good one, though Poirot had sniffed disapprovingly at my choice of reading material. When the aircraft suddenly lurched, my book tumbled to the floor as the fastened seatbelt sign illuminated with a sharp ping. Poirot, who had been napping, opened his eyes with a jolt. "Ladies and gentlemen," came the captain's voice over the speaker system, slightly distorted by static. "We are having some unexpected turbulence. Please return to your seats and secure your safety belts." Cabin crew secure the cabin. The stewards moved quickly through the aisle, checking that tables were folded and belongings were secured. One of them stumbled as the aircraft dipped again, catching himself on the back of Professor Finch's seat. The professor's papers scattered once more, drawing a muttered exclamation that sounded distinctly unprofessional. Most disagreeable, Poirot whispered, his fingers tightening over his armrests. His face had taken on a clear greenish hue across the aisle. Mrs. Carrington placed a handkerchief to her lips. Diana Leverson appeared impressively serene, applying a fresh layer of scarlet lipstick despite the aircraft's juttering motion. As the turbulence grew, the jet dipped quickly, eliciting a chorus of gasps. A water glass from the drink cart sailed through the air, shattering against a window with a crash that caused Lady West to emit a strangled cry for nearly 20 minutes. We were tossed about like a child's toy in a bathtub, and I must confess that even my naval experience did not entirely insulate me from a growing queasiness. Poirot had closed his eyes again, his lips moving in what I suspected was silent prayer. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the turbulence ceased, the aircraft leveled out, and a collective sigh of relief rippled through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain announced, "we have cleared the area of disturbance. You may unfasten your seat belts, but please remain near your seats as we may encounter further turbulence." Poirot mopped his forehead with his handkerchief, the humiliations one endures in the sake of modern convenience hastings. I went to grab my fallen book and watched Maxwell Reed Carrington's business associate making his way forward along the aisle, halting momentarily beside Carrington's seat. Their exchange was brief. Reed's expression tightened before he continued toward the lavatory. The chief steward, Andrews, according to his name badge, approached with a fresh drink cart, methodically working his way from the front of the cabin. When he reached Carrington, he leaned down to take the industrialist's order. A frown crossed Andrews' face. He touched Carrington's shoulder, then bent closer. Something in his posture captured Poirot's attention. "Pardon me, sir." Mr. Carrington, Andrews' voice carried. Poirot rose quickly and approached Carrington's seat. Myself, following close behind. Victor Carrington sat motionless, his head tilted slightly toward the window as though admiring the view. Only when one stood directly before him did the awful truth become apparent. His eyes stared unseeingly at the horizon, his skin already taking on a waxy pallor. A dark stain, small but unmistakable, marred the front of his immaculate suit jacket just over his heart. Andrew stuttered. Ted Poirot affirmed quietly. "Please fetch the captain quickly," as Andrews ran towards the cockpit. Poirot's gloved fingers softly touched Carrington's wrist, confirming what we already knew. His eyes furrowed as he examined the wound, careful not to disturb anything. "What is it? What's happening?" Mrs. Carrington partially moved from her seat, craning her neck to peer beyond the other passengers who had begun to notice the ruckus. "Please remain seated, madame," Poirot instructed firmly. Dr. Winters was already rushing toward us, medical bag in hand. "Let me through, please." Professor Finch looked over his spectacles. Lady West clutched her daughter's arm, talking hurriedly, as his aged face registered concern. Diana Leverson observed the spectacle with wide eyes, one hand pressed against her scarf-covered throat. The captain entered, his face graved behind his cap. After a brief examination and whispered consultation with Poirot and Doctor Winters, he addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I regret to inform you that we have experienced an incident. Mr. Carrington appears to have been," he hesitated, "fatally injured. We will divert to the nearest suitable airport." A fresh wave of murmurs swept through the cabin. Mrs. Carrington's face drained of color. Maxwell Reed, who had returned from the lavatory, stood frozen in the aisle. The captain conferred briefly with the navigator who had accompanied him, then turned back to the passengers. "I've been informed that, due to Dr. Winters, finished his preliminary examination," speaking gently to Poirot. The wound was a precise puncture, thin but deep, with minimal external bleeding. Death would have been nearly instantaneous. Poirot inquired. Not present, the doctor confirmed. Something thin and rigid with considerable strength behind it, and the time of death difficult to be precise at this altitude. But I would estimate within the last 30 minutes, during the turbulence most likely. Poirot addressed the startled passengers as "Ladies and gentlemen, a tragedy has occurred until we land. This aircraft is in effect sealed. No one may enter, no one may leave, while the proper authorities await our arrival. I shall, with the captain's permission, make preliminary inquiries." He paused, his eyes moving deliberately over each face. During the period of turbulence, every one of us was instructed to remain seated with belts fastened. But in that brief window of confusion and distraction, someone managed to commit murder. The facts suggest Maxwell Reed's jaw tightened significantly. Diana Leverson's fingers crumpled her handkerchief into a ball, and I prepared my notebook. Poirot softly put his hand into Carrington's jacket pocket and retrieved a small folded piece of paper. He gazed at it briefly, his countenance showing nothing, and placed it into his own pocket outside the windows. The endless blue sky spread in all directions, gorgeous and empty, with no escape for either victim or perpetrator. Chapter 3. The Little Grey Cells. The captain arranged for the rear section of the first-class cabin to be cordoned off with the heavy curtains normally used during overnight flights. This makeshift interview room, cramped though it was, would serve as Poirot's headquarters until we landed. Carrington's body had been respectfully covered and secured in the aircraft's small cargo hold, accessible only through a door behind the galley. Poirot put 2 chairs facing each other and precisely aligned a third at a perfect angle next one of them. He nodded for me to take notes from this third seat. Hastings informed me by tapping his temple that, most importantly, human memory is flawed. The written word endures. I nodded. Pen poised over my notebook. Andrews, the chief steward, stood nearby, awaiting instructions. "The seating chart, if you please." Poirot requested. Andrews provided a diagram of the cabin, which Poirot studied with narrowed eyes, and the passenger manifest with all names. "Here, sir." Andrews handed over a typewritten list. "The captain has asked me to assist you in any way possible." "Yeah, first I'd like to speak with Mrs. Carrington." Andrews slipped through the curtain. Moments later, she lowered her head slightly. "Thank you, Mr. Poirot. This is, quite unbelievable. Indeed, if you would permit me a few questions. Your husband, he had enemies." Victor had a penchant for making enemies, and it came with his specific brand of success. "Would you like to elaborate, madam?" Her fingers absently twisted the emerald ring. Victor believed business was war. He took no prisoners. Those steel mills the papers praise him for, built on the ruins of his competitors, his shipping concerns acquired through what some might call ruthless tactics, and yet you married him. A fleeting smile touched her lips. I was 22. Mr. Poirot Victor was established, successful, and persuasive, and the age gap did not bother you. Her gaze was steady. Poirot changed tact during the turbulence. You remained in your seat. "As instructed, I'm not fond of flying in the best conditions during turbulence." She shuddered delicately. "I wouldn't have moved for the world. Did you observe anyone who did move, madam?" She hesitated. I had my eyes closed for most of it. "The motion makes me ill, and your husband. When did you last speak with him?" "Shortly after the meal service. He indicated a business item he wanted to review." Her voice stayed steady. "Mr. Poirot, who would do this? Who could do this with all of us present? Madame is what we shall discover." Poirot raised slightly, marking the conclusion of the interviews. "One final question. Did your spouse carry any critical documents on this journey?" Something sparked behind her eyelids. Victor always carried important papers, and his briefcase should be with his possessions after she left. Poirot sat calmly for several moments, his fingers tucked beneath his chin. "Well, Hastings, your impressions?" I tapped my pen against my notebook, rather composed for a newly made widow, wouldn't you say? However, shock affects people differently, so we must reserve judgment. Professor Finch followed, his weathered face revealing anger at the disruption to his travels. I couldn't see how I could help as he settled his lanky figure into the chair. I was working on my monograph throughout the flight, even throughout the turbulence. Professor, especially then focusing on my work, helps me ignore unpleasantness. He removed his spectacles, polishing them with a handkerchief. "I've spent decades on excavations in remote locations. A bit of rough air is hardly noteworthy. You're acquainted with Mr. Carrington?" Finch's hand paused mid-polish. "We've crossed paths. He donated to several archaeological foundations. Our relationship was purely professional, not entirely cordial." Perhaps, Poirot suggested mildly. Finch replaced Mr. Poirot, had little reason to commit murder. Finch's tone chilled perceptibly, despite the fact that I was in my seat throughout. Anyone would affirm it came next. Maxwell Reed Carrington's business partner. The man's complexion had a greyish tinge, his motions stiff as he sat down. He began a dreadful business before Poirot could speak, simply terrible. Victor and I had our arguments, which he broke off by passing a hand across his face. Mr. Reed's shoulders tensed in routine business disagreements. Nothing unusual for partners, yet you were observed having what appeared to be a heated exchange with Mr. Carrington before takeoff. Reed's eyes widened momentarily. We were discussing the Wheeler merger. Victor wanted to proceed aggressively. I counseled caution, hardly unusual. And during the turbulence, strapped in my seat like everyone else. I value my neck too much to wander about during such conditions. He leaned forward. Look, I had no reason to harm. Victor and our partnership. His voice drifted off, meaningfully. Diana Levison's appearance made a subtle alteration to the ambiance of our improvised interview room. The actress moved with practiced grace, placing herself in the chair with the precision of one accustomed to being observed. Mr. Poirot, Captain Hastings, Miss Levison, were you familiar with the deceased Victor? Her painted lips curved slightly. Yes, we knew each other some years ago before his marriage, a romantic association. Poirot inquired delicately. She adjusted her silk scarf, briefly. Victor was persistent when he wanted something, or someone. The scarf slipped slightly, revealing a thin silver chain at her neck. But that was long ago. We've maintained cordial relations since you did not speak with him during this flight. Only in passing, I congratulated him on his recent acquisition of transatlantic airways. Her eyes met Poirot's as I sat in my seat during turbulence. Mr. Poirot, I'm sure the stewards will confirm it as our interviews continue. Lord Westholme reluctantly admitted to significant investments in Carrington's ventures, while Dr. Winters revealed he had once testified against Carrington in a lawsuit brought by injured factory workers. Each passenger provided alibis that appeared unassailable, but each harbored connections to the victim that could constitute motive between interviews. Poirot slipped out to examine the galley area and the drink cart that had been in use at the time of the murder. His attention to these seemingly mundane items drew curious glances from the flight crew, but he offered no explanation for his interest. When we had a moment alone, I consulted my notes. Everyone claims to have remained seated, but someone clearly did not. Poirot nodded and carefully stroked the folded paper he had extracted from Carrington's pocket between his fingers. What does it say? I asked. Remember Icarus? He read, most interesting, is it not the mythological figure who flew too close to the sun? His eyes drifted toward the window, where the afternoon sun blazed across the vast emptiness surrounding our aircraft. In that moment, suspended between heaven and earth, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cabin's temperature. Chapter 4. While Poirot continued his methodical interviews, I took the opportunity to observe our fellow passengers from a discreet position near the galley. Tension had transformed the luxurious cabin into a pressure vessel of suspicion. Mrs. Carrington sat with her face turned toward the window, the sunlight catching the copper highlights in her hair. Lady Westholme leaned across the aisle to whisper something to her, but Mrs. Carrington simply shook her head. Reed walked the tiny confines of the cabin, 3 steps forward, 3 steps back, his hands clasped behind his back. Each time he passed Diana Levison's seat, his gait faltered almost imperceptibly. Andrews approached me with a silver coffee pot. Coffee, sir. Thank you. Yes. As he poured, I casually inquired, did you notice anything unusual before or during the turbulence? The steward's hand remained steady, but a muscle twitched at the corner of his jaw, only that Miss Levison visited the lavatory shortly before we hit the rough air. She was just returning to her seat when the captain illuminated the seatbelt sign. I made a mental note of this detail which contradicted her assertion of remaining seated throughout. And the drink cart, was it in service? During the turbulence? No, sir, we had just begun service when the turbulence hit protocol requirements. A steward had placed Carrington's briefcase and personal stuff on a fold-down table in our interview room. Poirot opened the leather suitcase with gloved hands, slowly spreading its contents before us. What do you see? He murmured. The suitcase held many file folders full of contracts and financial information, a leather-bound appointment book and a smaller notepad with a black cover for business paperwork. I offered nothing unusual for a man of his position, Prime, but Poirot lifted the small notebook, carefully turning its pages. As I leaned closer, The notebook contained a series of entries in Carrington's bold handwriting. Most appeared to be standard business notations, but several pages contained cryptic references. Operation Icarus Phase 2. Mr. Wavering apply pressure. WF connection secured AF situation. Neutralized below these entries a series of initials with numbers next to them. The last page had yesterday's date in a single notation. 40,000 feet ideal conditions initials. I muttered. Mr. Could be Maxwell Reed and AF Professor Ambrose Finch. Perhaps Poirot proposed the little grey cells. They are beginning to organize the pieces. A tap at the curtain halted us. Dr. Winters stood there, his lean face somber. Mr. Poirot and I've been considering the wound its most uncommon, a single puncture narrow but deep directly to the heart. The weapon would need to be extraordinarily thin enough to generate a minimum entry hole, yet rigid enough to penetrate a fitted suit shirt and sternum with adequate force. Poirot nodded a stiletto. Perhaps, possibly, but I've searched everyone's belongings as requested. Nothing of the sort was found. The doctor stopped. There's something else. The wound edges were strange, almost as if Poirot prompted, as if the weapon itself had changed shape after penetration. The doctor shook his head, medically impossible. Of course, after the doctor departed, Poirot requested Andrews bring him the passenger manifests for the entire aircraft, including those in the economy cabin behind us. He studied these intently before slipping them into his pocket. Poirot announced that there is a matter concerning the galley that I would like to clarify as we moved on. Diana Leveson entered from the restroom, her eyes widening slightly at our rapid arrival. Her hand darted to her scarf, fixing it with trained grace. Mr. Poirot, she acknowledged coolly. Miss Leveson Poirot's eyes noted every detail of her appearance. I understand you visited the lavatory shortly before the turbulence began, not during the entire event as you had indicated earlier. A flash of annoyance alarm crossed her face before her features composed themselves. Did I say that? How careless of me. Yes, I did visit the lavatory. Briefly, my compact had slipped from my handbag, and I wished to fix my appearance, I see. Did you witness anything weird during this brief expedition? Nothing at all. Her fingers flirted with the silver chain around her neck. If you'll excuse me, in the galley, Andrews showed us the service arrangements, including the drink cart that was in operation at the time of the murder. Poirot studied it meticulously, opening each drawer and cabinet. The ice pick Andrews Poirot inquired about the ice service, where it is kept. Andrews blinked. Ice pick, sir. We don't carry such instruments. Safety rules. The ice is pre-cut in the commissary before loading. Indeed, Poirot raised an eyebrow, but you have a freezer compartment in the galley. Yes, sir, for chilling champagne and storing perishables during meal service. Poirot bent to investigate the compartment in issue, then straightened with a satisfied nod and walked to the rubbish bins, meticulously sifting through discarded napkins, glasses, and food containers. Hastings, he mumbled. Do you remember the drink service that was halted by the turbulence? Coffee and lures. I confirmed the cart had just arrived at Carrington's Row, and what beverages were being served. I frowned, trying to remember coffee, and I believe I saw brandy whiskey, perhaps some cordials. And how were these served in glasses with ice for those who requested it, with ice? Poirot repeated softly, most significant. As we returned to the main cabin, the airplane experienced another area of turbulence, though milder than before. The passengers grasped their armrests, their faces taut with the twin terror of the harsh air and the knowledge that a killer was among them. Professor Finch gripped Poirot's sleeve as we passed. I've been thinking about that note. Recall Icarus. In the tail, Icarus rejected warnings and soared too near to the sun. His wings kept together by wax melted. His demise was the direct result of his hubris, a most striking remark. Professor Poirot bowed his head and asked, in your archaeological work, have you encountered weapons made of unusual materials that might change their form after use? Finch's bushy brows raised an interesting question. Ancient tribes fashioned weapons from a variety of material. He hesitated. There are reports from northern expeditions of hunters employing ice spears, frozen water sharpened to a fatal point, the perfect disposable weapon melting away and leaving no trace. Poirot muttered most illuminating back at our chairs. He studied my notes while Poirot looked thoughtfully out the window. The afternoon sun had begun its descent, pouring long golden rays around the cabin. The light struck a discarded drink stir in the aisle, its crystal surface refracting tiny rainbows across the carpet. Poirot followed my sight and abruptly bent to get it, turning it over in his gloved fingers. Something in his expression changed, the slight widening of the eyes, the almost imperceptible nod that I had come to recognize as the moment when a critical piece of the puzzle fell into place. He slipped the stir into his pocket and withdrew a handkerchief, carefully collecting several drops of water from different locations. The condensation on a window, a drop from the galley sink, and moisture from the outside of a water glass. With each sample, he created a small damp circle on the handkerchief, marking each with his pen. When I raised an inquiring brow, he simply tapped the side of his egg-shaped head. 5 hours had never seemed so long, nor the confined space of the aircraft cabin so dangerous. Chapter 5. The story thickens. The captain's voice crackled through the speaker system, stating that we were approaching the coordinates for a possible emergency landing at a little airfield in eastern Canada. A ripple of relief passed through the cabin. Poirot, however, appeared vexed by this development. "We require more time, Meistings," he murmured, tucking his handkerchief of water samples carefully into his breast pocket. "The solution is forming, but it is not yet complete." He rose abruptly and made his way to the cockpit. I remained in my seat observing the passengers. Mrs. Carrington dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, the first visible sign of grief she had displayed since her husband Finch had resumed his work, though his eyes constantly flickered to the other passengers over the rims of his spectacles. Dr. Winters appeared to be dozing, but the tension in his jaw belied any genuine rest. Most intriguing was the behavior of Maxwell Reed and Diana Leverson. Reed had taken a seat at the back of the cabin, and Miss Leverson, after a moment's hesitation, joined him. Their conversation appeared intense, her head bent close to his fingers nervously toying with his watch chain. When she placed her hand briefly on his arm, he shook it off with a sharp gesture that spoke volumes. Poirot returned his expression unreadable. There has been a change in plans. Canadian airfield reports. We continue to New York, despite the limited visibility caused by the sudden fog. A ghost of a smile graced his lips. Fate seemed to have provided us the time we require. He signaled for me to accompany him to the galley, where he opened the freezer compartment. Once more, he removed a tray of ice cubes and examined each one with his pocket magnifying glass. "What exactly are you looking for?" I inquired about evidence of tampering monomy. "Ah," he said, pointing to small scratches on the internal surface. "Someone has used this compartment for purposes other than chilling champagne." Andrews appeared with new coffee. "The captain asked me to advise you that we're continuing to New York, Mr. Poirot. We should land in approximately 3.5 hours. Terrific. Tell me, Andrews, the drink cart. It has been restocked after the incident." "Yes, sir. Typical practice. We cleaned it properly and readied it for the pre-landing service. I'd like to see its contents." Poirot requested that Andrews lead us to where the cart stood ready, its chrome surface gleaming under the cabin lights. Poirot inspected each drawer and compartment, paying particular attention to the waste receptacle. At one end, most interesting, in the previous contents of this waste bin. Where were they discarded in the main galley bin? Sir Poirot nodded. Seemingly satisfied, he then asked to examine Carrington's personal effects. Once more, the steward led them to our temporary interview location, where Poirot focused on the victim's briefcase. The lock Hastings noticed marks around it. Someone has attempted to access this case since our last study. I glanced at the tiny markings that had not been present earlier, but who could have done? Indeed, we have been preoccupied with our inquiry. The passengers have had the opportunity. A brief area of turbulence interrupted our talk. The aircraft descended swiftly and stabilized through the break in the curtains. I noticed Lane Carrington clutching something in her hand, a torn photograph which she hastily attempted to conceal in her handbag as the aircraft steadied Poirot. Followed my gaze. Perhaps Madame Carrington wishes to dispose of certain memories. Retrieve it, if you please, Hastings, with discretion. I approached Mrs. Carrington, offering her a fresh cup of tea as she accepted. I noticed the edge of the photograph protruding from her bag. When she excused herself to visit the La Poirot, examined the torn image, which showed 3 men on what appeared to be a hunting expedition. Carrington, Maxwell Reed, and a 3rd man whose face had been deliberately removed from the photograph. They stood against a snowy backdrop, holding rifles, their breath visible in the frigid air, an expedition to colder climates. Poirot noticed most suggestive, but who is the 3rd man? That, mon ami, is a very good question. Poirot sought Professor Finch's presence. Again, the archaeologist approached our curtained alcove with obvious reluctance. Professor, during your long travels, you have undoubtedly experienced many hunting and survival strategies from other tribes. Finch adjusted his spectacles naturally. The study of historical civilizations necessarily includes their means of nourishment and warfare, including possibly tactics from Arctic regions. Inuit methods, or Siberian perhaps, a flicker of understanding crossed Finch's weathered face. You're referring to ice weapons? Yes, I'm familiar with them academically. Of course, ancient Arctic hunters would fashion knife blades and spear points from ice when other materials were unavailable in the extreme cold. Ice can become nearly as hard as steel, and these techniques are recorded and available to people with scientific interest. I've published on the subject myself, and any university library would have it. His eyes narrowed. You can't seriously advise. I suggest nothing, Professor. I only want knowledge. Poirot smiled. Jeannie, tell me how such a weapon would be stabilized. Ice alone would be difficult to grip, and Finch's hesitated, then continued reluctantly. Typically, a handle would be fashioned from available materials, wood, bone leather wrappings. The blade would be temporarily affixed using water as an adhesive. In freezing temperatures, it forms an extremely effective bond, and at normal temperatures, the ice would begin to melt, would not be rapidly, minutes perhaps, depending on ambient temperature. I see most illuminating, Poirot, dismissing the professor with a nod, and Finch had gone. Poirot turned to me, and we progressed. Our chat was interrupted by rising voices from the main cabin. Lady Westholme and Maxwell Reed appeared to be engaged in a furious exchange, their whispers carrying an intensity that drew all eyes toward them. I warned you it was lunacy. Lady Westholme growled her aristocratic decorum. Sliding Reed held her wrist. Control yourself. This isn't the time or place. Poirot studied this interaction with intense curiosity. When the altercation calmed, he approached the drink cart once more, scrutinizing the contents of each glass and cup with painstaking care. When the steward served the pre-landing refreshments, the afternoon sun was low on the horizon, casting long shadows through the cabin. Poirot stood by the window, gazing outward, his silhouette sharp against the golden light in his hand. He held the torn photograph, turning it over repeatedly as if the answers to our questions might materialize from its glossy surface. I could almost see the workings of those famous little gray cells as he stood there, motionless. Chapter 6. Interactions. The evening sun bathed the cabin in amber light as Poirot placed his notes in exact stacks on the little table. I'd rarely seen him so meticulous, a clue of the complexity of the case that confronted us. He tapped his slender finger across Carrington's notebook, squinting at the enigmatic entries. Hastings, he said, we must establish the true relationships between our fellow passengers. The surface connections reveal only part of the picture. He took out a sheet of paper and began drawing lines connecting names, forming a web of associations. Victor Carrington in the center, with spokes extending outward to each suspect, continued. Mr. Reed and Mr. Carrington were business partners in a contentious merger. What was it called? The Wheeler merger, I supplied. Consulting my notes precisely, and Lord Westholme had invested heavily in this venture, had he not yet, moments ago, we observed, Lady Westholme engaged in a most intense discussion with Mr. Reed. Not the behavior one would expect between mere social acquaintances. A steward approached with fresh coffee, which Poirot accepted with a nod of thanks after the man departed. Poirot leaned closer. Now let us examine Dr. Winters. He claimed a professional grievance against Carrington, testifying in a lawsuit brought by factory workers, a matter of principle, he suggested. Poirot's eyebrows rose skeptically. Yet I have discovered that shortly after this testimony, Dr. Winters' medical research funding was mysteriously withdrawn. The timing it suggested, I added. But did she tell us the full extent of this relationship? I think not. Pooh gestured toward the cabin and observed her interactions with Mr. Reed. They speak as people who share secrets, not as casual acquaintances outside our curtained alcove. The routine of the aircraft continued, and Andrews and his team prepared for the final meal service before landing through the gap. I observed Diana Leveson walk toward the restroom at the back of the cabin. Her silk scarf had been removed, showing a slender neck ornamented with a silver chain from which dangled a little pendant. "That pendant," I mumbled. "She's been concealing it beneath her scarf." Indeed, most intriguing. Poirot's eyes shone when she returned. "Note the passengers she interacts with and their reactions." A piercing exclamation near the galley grabbed our attention, Professor. Finch stood with a newspaper in hand, nodding animatedly to Dr. Winters. The doctor's face was drained of color as he inspected whatever Finch was showing him. Poirot watched this conversation with intense interest. The professor appears to have made a finding of his own most opportune. The tension in the cabin had taken on an almost perceptible dimension. Mrs. Carrington remained secluded in her grief. Real or manufactured, I could not distinguish. Lord Westholme consulted his pocket watch with more often, his aristocratic decorum fraying at the seams. "Let us review what we have established," Poirot remarked, returning to his notes. Mr. Carrington was engaged in a business venture that involved several of our fellow passengers. "This operation, Icarus," he wrote in his journal. A sudden patch of severe turbulence interrupted his analysis. The aircraft lurched violently, causing papers to scatter across our small table. The cabin lights flickered once-twice, then went out entirely, plunging us into the dim glow of the emergency lighting. Exclamations of alarm rose from the passengers in the ghostly blue illumination shadows, transformed familiar faces into masks of anxiety and fear for nearly 30 seconds. We remained suspended in this twilight state before the main lights hummed back to life, and we could immediately gather. Hastings hissed the page from Carrington's notebook with the initials, "It has been taken." I checked the floor. The seats, every exposed surface. You confident it hasn't simply blown away in the confusion? Pretty certain this was not an accident. Someone has exploited the opportunity to obtain proof. Poirot's eyes widened, but a quick sweep of the cabin found all passengers apparently in their allotted seats, with emotions ranging from moderate apprehension to full dread. Nothing in their behavior suggested who would have crept behind our curtain during those brief moments of darkness. "Hastings," whispered Poirot, "I require your assistance when next the drink cart passes. Observe carefully which passenger disposes of anything in the waste receptacle, and note who visits the lavatory in the next 15 minutes. The pre-landing meal service began shortly thereafter. Andrews carried the freshly stocked drink cart down the aisle, serving beverages and light refreshments. I positioned myself near the galley, displaying casual curiosity while maintaining a clear view of all passengers. Diana Leveson declined to eat and drink. Her gaze was caught on a little notebook, remarkably identical to the one we had recovered among Carrington's stuff. Maxwell Reed took a whiskey, which he consumed in a one sip before demanding another, Professor. Finch took tea, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he stirred in sugar. Most telling was Dr. Winter's reaction when offered coffee. He began to refuse, then paused, glancing toward Poirot before accepting as Andrews moved on. The doctor stared into the cup without drinking, then abruptly rose and headed toward the lavatory, the untouched coffee abandoned on his tray table. I signaled discreetly to Poirot, who acknowledged with an almost imperceptible nod. When Dr. Winters emerged, Poirot slipped from our alcove and made his way to the galley, where he conducted one final examination of the freezer compartment. Whatever he discovered, there seemed to satisfy him, because he returned with the subtle smile that I had come to recognize as a sign that the final pieces of his puzzle were falling into place. "I believe I now understand the method, Hastings," he murmured, settling beside me. "A most ingenious approach, combining elements of opportunity, scientific knowledge." The captain's voice came over the speaker system, announcing our final approach to New York. The skyline appeared on the horizon, a jagged silhouette against the deepening twilight. We would soon be on the ground, where police would take control of the investigation, but as we began our descent, I sensed that the most dangerous part of our journey still lay ahead. One of the 8 passengers in our cabin had demonstrated both the ingenuity and Chapter 7, Descent into Darkness. The Stratoliner tilted forward as we began our final approach to New York. Through the window, the city's lights glimmered like scattered jewels against the darkening sky. Under ordinary circumstances, the view would have been breathtaking now, which simply signaled that our time was running out. Poirot had emerged from behind our curtained alcove with a curious air of calm resolve. His bow tie sat perfectly straight, his mustache impeccably groomed, only the intensity of his gaze. "Captain," he addressed the aircraft's commander, who had joined us in the cabin, "I'd like to gather all of the passengers together before we land. There are matters that must be addressed while we're still in flight." The captain gave a nod. "Of course, Mr. Poirot, we have approximately 20 minutes before touchdown. That will suffice." The passengers were told to go to the forward area of the cabin, which they did with varied degrees of reluctance, some gathering their personal belongings as if ready for rapid departure. Professor Finch slipped his valuable notes inside his leather satchel. Diana Leverson tightened her scarf once more around her neck, the pendant neatly disguised behind the silk. Elaine Carrington took her place behind Lady Westholme, her copper hair catching the cabin lights as she lifted her chin forward in a show of defiance. Dr. Winters positioned himself slightly aside from the others, rhythmically tapping his slender fingers against his medical bag. Maxwell Reed was the last to join the gathering. His complexion had taken on an ashen quality, beads of perspiration visible on his forehead. Despite the cabin's controlled temperature, he claimed a seat at the back of the group, his eyes darting between Poirot and the cabin door as though calculating distances. The aircraft encountered minor turbulence, causing a momentary distraction. I observed Dr. Winters lean closer, Professor Finch, muttering something that made the archaeologist tense visibly before Poirot could continue his address. Winters climbed to his feet. "I believe I know what happened here," he said, his voice carrying an edge of barely controlled tension. "And I know who is responsible." Poirot raised an eyebrow and stayed mute, allowing the doctor to continue. Reed Winters pointed an accusatory finger. "Maxwell Reed killed Carrington. I observed him with an unusual object shortly before the turbulence, something long and cylindrical, which he hastily concealed in his jacket." Reed sprang to his feet, his face contorting with wrath. "That's crazy. I was in my seat the entire time." "Winters counted you moved at the worst of the turbulence. I noticed because I was frightened about my medical equipment shifting in the overhead compartment. This is unacceptable." Reed's voice raised rapidly. If anyone had motive, it was Carrington's wife. The man was wealthy millions, and their marriage was hardly pleasant. All eyes shifted to Elaine Carrington, who stayed impressively serene under this unexpected scrutiny. "How dare you?" she replied calmly. Victor and I had our issues, but I had no cause to wish him dead. Reed chuckled coldly. "What about your friendship with Professor Finch? Did you suppose no one noticed the glances you shared while Victor's focus was elsewhere?" The professor removed his spectacles, polishing them with deliberate care. "You overstep, sir. Mrs. Carrington consulted me regarding artifacts her husband acquired during his travels." Nothing more. The allegations continued to fly across the cabin. Diana Leveson was accused of harboring a decades-old grudge over a romantic rejection. Lord Westham allegedly faced financial ruin if Carrington withdrew from their joint venture. Each accusation was met with vehement denial, followed by a counter-accusation. Through it all, Poirot observed silently, his head tilted slightly to one side. I recognized this posture because he was allowing the suspects to reveal themselves through their emotional reactions, noting which accusations elicited the most vigorous responses. Dr. Winters remained standing, his medical authority lending weight to his accusations against Reed. The wound was consistent with a thin, rigid implement. Reed has experience with hunting weapons. The connection is obvious if we're discussing hunting experience. Reed countered, "Don't forget our distinguished archaeologist, Professor Finch, has extensive knowledge of primitive weapons, including those used in Arctic conditions. Carrington cancelled his money just last month." The professor removed his spectacles completely, and his weathered face flushed. "My research grant is unlikely a motive for murder, and I was working throughout the flight." Madame Zer Messier Poirot eventually injected his voice, cutting through the commotion like a dagger. "This exhibition of allegation is quite instructive, but perhaps we should study facts rather than guesses." He turned to the captain. "I assume you've alerted the authorities about our position?" The captain nodded. "Police will be waiting at the gate. They've ordered that all passengers remain seated upon arrival." "Excellent, then perhaps we should." A sudden powerful tremor shook the airplane, knocking Poirot against the bulkhead. The cabin lights flickered ominously, gasps and shouts of terror filled the air, and oxygen masks dropped from overhead compartments. "Just air turbulence," the captain assured everyone, his professional serenity contrasting sharply with the rising apprehension. "Please return to your seats and fasten your belts for landing." As the passengers complied, I witnessed a communication between Professor Finch and Dr. Winters, a fleeting, meaningful glance that spoke of shared awareness. Diana Leveson grasped her pendant through her scarf, her fingers whitening from the power of her grip. Maxwell Reed wiped perspiration off his brow with a monogrammed handkerchief and carefully returned it to his breast pocket. Poirot beckoned me closer as he reclaimed his own seat. "Observe, Hastings," he murmured. "In moments of crisis, people reveal their true concerns. Note how Reed preserves that handkerchief, despite his agitation. Most significant, through the window, the lights of the approaching airport grew larger, the landing gear deployed with a mechanical groan that reverberated through the cabin. Poirot sat very still, his eyes half closed in concentration. I recognized this expression. He was analyzing every aspect, every connection, ensuring his solution was flawless before revealing it. The aircraft continued to descend. As we reached the runway, the engines changed pitch, and the cabin fell into an unnatural silence. Each passenger appeared engrossed in private thoughts or anxieties. Mrs. Carrington stared, straight ahead, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Lord and Lady West exchanged whispers behind cupped palms. Professor Finch had removed a small notebook from his jacket pocket, reviewing its contents with fierce concentration, and Maxwell Reed, the man accused by Dr. Winters, sat rigid in his seat, his gaze fixed on some middle distance, his fingers still clutching the handkerchief that had drawn Poirot's attention. The runway lights appeared below us, a string of pearls guiding our approach through the gathering darkness. In mere minutes, we would be on the ground, where police would take Chapter 8, The Frozen Truth, The Stratoliner came to a complete halt at the gate, but the captain explained that at Poirot's request, no one would exit until further notice. Through the windows, police trucks were visible on the tarmac, their red lights flashing in the evening darkness. Poirot stood at the front of the cabin, his diminutive figure commanding the attention of everyone present. The passengers had been instructed to return to their original seats, a tableau frozen in time recreating the scene before Carrington's murder. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot began, his accent more pronounced than usual, a sign I recognized as indicating his immense satisfaction with the solution he was about to unveil. We had traveled together through the sky on a journey. Andrews and the other stewards stood at the back of the cabin. 2 police officers were allowed to board, but waited at the exit at Poirot's request. The murder of Victor Carrington presented an apparently unsolvable dilemma. Poirot continued a man stabbed to death in a confined space under the observation of his fellow passengers. With no weapon found simple and yet it happened, Mrs. Carrington sat rigidly in her seat. Her fingers toying with her emerald ring, Professor Finch appeared to be studying Poirot with academic interest. Dr. Winters maintained his professional composure, though his fingers drummed an irregular rhythm against his knee. "Let us first consider the false solutions," Poirot continued. "One might suggest that Mrs. Carrington killed her husband for his fortune, yet she was observed throughout the turbulence. Her eyes closed in distress, Lady Westholme might have desired to protect her family's investments, but she too remained clearly visible in her seat." He paced slowly down the aisle, his hands clasped behind his back. Professor Finch had academic grievances, but his elaborate papers would surely have been disturbed had he left his seat. Diana Levison harbored old resentments, yet her movements to and from the lavatory were noted by the cabin staff. Miss Levison's hand moved unconsciously to her scarf, confirming her awareness of being observed. Dr. Winters, as a medical specialist, would understand human anatomy and the perfect area to strike for quick effect. However, what weapon might he have used, and where could he have concealed it? The same questions apply to Lord Westholme. Poirot paused beside. Maxwell Reed's seat. Reed's face had taken on an almost greyish pallor, the collar of his shirt dark with perspiration despite the cabin's cool temperature, and then we have Mr. Reed's business partner rival, and the man with perhaps the strongest motive. The Wheeler merger was failing, and Mr. Carrington planned to withdraw, leaving Reed facing financial ruin and even criminal prosecution. Reed's knuckles whitened as he gripped the armrests, but the central question remains the weapon. Where is the instrument that caused the narrow, deep wound in Mr. Carrington's chest? The stewards searched the aircraft. Nothing was found. Nothing could be found, because the weapon itself, Poirot paused dramatically, no longer exists. A murmur passed through the cabin. The weapon Poirot declared was made of ice. The silence that followed was absolute. A dagger of ice, fashioned in the galley freezer before the flight, perfectly designed for its purpose, rigid enough to penetrate clothing and flesh, narrow enough to create a minimal wound, and with the remarkable property of destroying itself after serving its purpose, it simply melted away, leaving only the inexplicable wound. I watched the faces of our fellow passengers, most registered shock or disbelief. Only Maxwell Reed remained utterly still, his eyes fixed on Poirot with a gaze of terrible intensity. "But ice alone would not suffice," Poirot continued. "One cannot easily grip a shaft of ice. A handle would be required, something to provide stability and force, something that could be easily disposed of afterward." He turned to Andrews. "The drink cart, if you please." The steward pulled the cart forward and opened its trash receptacle, retrieving a little paper bag containing a scrap of cloth salvaged from the galley waste bin, a cloth with signs of blood. Mr. Carrington's blood and fibers from a monogrammed handkerchief. All eyes moved to Maxwell Reed, whose monogrammed handkerchief was visible in his breast pocket. "The approach was simple, yet brilliant," Poirot continued. "During preparations for the flight, Mr. Reed fashioned a dagger from ice in the galley freezer. He stabilized it with a wooden handle, possibly a stirrer or similar item wrapped in cloth for greater grip. The cloth came from a handkerchief, identical to the one he carries. Now Reed remained silent, though a muscle twitched in his jaw when the turbulence began. Attention was diverted. The drink cart, not properly secured, rolled slightly. Mr. Reed seized this moment to retrieve his weapon from wherever he had concealed it, perhaps in the lavatory or within his own belongings, a swift, precise strike to Mr. Carrington's heart during the most violent moments of turbulence the victim made. The deed was done. Poirot's voice softened as the ice dagger was left embedded, beginning its inevitable dissolution. The wooden handle, wrapped in the telltale cloth, was quickly disposed of in a used coffee cup on the drink cart. By the time the body was discovered, the ice had melted completely, leaving only the wound. He turned to face Reed directly. "But you made one error. See, the cloth still contained microscopic amounts of blood, and when I checked the waste receptacle, I discovered fibers that matched your monogrammed handkerchief, which you had so carefully saved even during times of tremendous anguish." Reed's serenity eventually snapped. "You can prove nothing," he snarled. "A few fibers circumstantial at best." "Perhaps," Poirot admitted, "but there is more operation." Icarus, the project indicated in Mr. Carrington's notebook, is not a business initiative at all, but a code name for his inquiry into your embezzlement from the company. He uncovered your scams, your falsified accounts, and he meant to expose you upon reaching New York. Your thinking Reed challenged, but his voice lacked conviction. Normia. The tattered photos of the hunting excursion in Arctic conditions you learnt survival tactics, including the fabrication of ice weapons. Professor Finch recognized the third man in the photos, with the skillfully removed face, as the guide who taught you these skills from scholarly literature. He is an expert in traditional Arctic hunting ways. Reed's shoulders fell, the fight clearly fading from him. Poirot added, addressing the entire cabin, "Mr. Reed's monogrammed handkerchiefs are unique, made from a distinctive Egyptian cotton with a particular weave. The fibers found in the waste receptacle will match precisely. The evidence, while small, is conclusive." 2 police officers moved forward at the captain's signal, Reed offering no resistance as they took positions on either side of his seat. "Victor was going to ruin me," Reed said, his voice barely audible. 30 years building our company, and he would throw it all away because of a few accounting irregularities. He didn't understand what was at stake. Poirot's gaze remained deadpan. "Murder is never an irregularity." Mature as the officers escorted Reed from the aircraft, the remaining passengers sat in stunned silence. The perfect crime. Almost perfect had been solved. The weapon that vanished the murder in plain sight. The sealed environment that should have made escape impossible, all unraveled by Poirot's little gray cells outside the window. The lights of New York sparkled against the night sky. We had traveled thousands of miles across the Atlantic, only to discover that the darkest. Remember to observe the minor things. Exercise your little gray cells, and never underestimate the cunning of the criminal mind, or the investigator who follows it. This is Edward signing off from Sherlock Mysteries.